down at the moment, it's finding a real difficulty. It says on here, sort of like I'm Citizens Eye co-editor, which is true, but Keith just said to me, do you still have your proper job? Which is Community Engagement Librarian for Leicester Libraries, and there's been a bit of a convoluted way how I've got to this position. So not only do I co-edit Citizens Eye with John now, I actually do some of the citizen reporting as well. So usually, if it gets into the Mercury and it's my piece, it's going to be say Citizens Eye says, because I don't put it in under my name at the moment because of my job. So because it's an interesting political balancing act, that for me. How we got together, John came to me in 2008. We met during the preparations for Refugee Week. I just finished a sort of like project with refugees and asylum seekers to actually get them work experience, because they can't actually work in the country while they're over here until they get their status. That had just come to an end, so I was looking for new ways of getting refugees and asylum seekers involved. John came to me with Elisha Shamba, who became the editor of Hat News, and said, we're operating out of Voluntary Action Leicester. The computers are constantly crashing. Can you host him in the library? I immediately gave Elisha a desk. The next development was I met John over at Val, and he was talking about the embryonic wave preparations for wave, because the young people had said they'd like their own newspaper. And we were talking about locations of where that could happen, and I said, well, why don't you use the libraries across Leicester, because they're open after school hours, they're open on Saturdays and weekends if they want to use it, and also all the staff are CRB checked, so they could do interviews in there and use the places without John having to have all the hassle of doing that. So that's how that developed originally, and then that swiftly followed on to John saying, having problems with the computers in Val, and I said, well, why don't you actually move Citizens Eye into the library? So that, for a city council, would normally be really hard to do, but luckily my boss is a bit of a visionary, and he immediately saw the relationship between kind of a community media organisation and a library service, which is actually there providing information for people across the city, or should be. My big thing is the fact that that service in libraries has invariably been very passive. It just receives kind of information. It doesn't go out and get information and promote information necessarily in any other ways than kind of posters on walls and sort of like stuff like that. I was very interested in the ways that John was talking about getting news and information out there to communities, not only to get information to them, but as a potential for them to deliver their own information. So that's what we did. One of the managers was on holiday for 2 weeks. We moved John into her office. It was a bit of a shock for her when she came through. But
that is true.
Then that swiftly developed. John had access to some of the other spaces in the library, and we did, together we did sort of like training sessions, so I got a little bit of training on how to do things, and became more and more interested in actually how to, construct an article, interview people, and I hadn't done any of that kind of stuff before, and Keith knows I applied to go on the Amplified Leicester, project that was happening out of DMU, and I hadn't really used any kind of social media or anything like that until then. So my attitude to that was like, well, let's try and learn something new to see how that would work for us. So I did that, and now I'm using the flip cams, the sort of like voice recorders, using well, I've still got to have my iPadio sort of like thing set up, which John keeps chastising me about, but that's next. And what it is that for me, as a community engagement librarian, it's an easy way, or a really creative way, of engaging communities about what's happening in their areas, not only for the news stories that develops, but also as feedback for our service as how we can do things better. what that is actually proving to be is quite a difficult balancing act, because there's not necessarily hostility, but there's some resistance to, certainly within librarianship, and it's it has been quite a conservative sort of like profession, and introducing this kind of stuff is actually being a bit of a revolution to them. But what I've noticed is in the last few months I keep getting asked to speak more and more about community media and its relationship with, or potential relationship with, libraries, both as locations and as an add-on to the profession. And what's happening now is that there's suddenly become a real interest in it, whereas before it was like, well, how can we apply that to our service? That's still going on within my service. I mean, I have quite a lot of resistance from library management team. Some support it, some don't. You know, is that anything to do with libraries? Should we be doing that? Isn't that, you know, journalism, isn't it? But if you look at it from the point of view of information provision, that's where I come to it. And also the fact that the library service has lots of kind of workers engaging people in creative writing, and they can do that by having kind of poetry workshops, how to write, you know, a short story, how to develop a novel, things like that. But they don't really have anything for people who are interested in kind of news delivery and information provision and non-fiction writing. So I see this as a way of developing that, and also in engaging people in using skills that they might not have or use or haven't used recently. I mean, we've got a lot of people who are coming in and volunteering who've done some writing in their past. They've been like English literature, you know, students or language students, but they've not really had a chance to develop that writing. So it gives a chance to do that. And within my role, it gives John and me it's capacity building. We have spaces to use, you know, we have people interested, and I can take a lot of the really practical, not necessarily boring, but the things like CRB checks. If anybody's working with the people from Wave, we can do that, or I can write all the references for people who actually do work with us, you know, for when they're going for jobs. And it's obviously working because I'm writing references constantly for people, which is really good. And quite a lot of them have gone on to get jobs because they've done stuff like this. So certainly for Elisha, he went for his first job, you know, having been an asylum seeker, he got his refugee status. Of course, he didn't have any references at all over here that were relevant. He had them from Zimbabwe, but he didn't have anything over here. He went for an interview, not necessarily related to journalism, and they said, well, you know, have you got any proof of what you've done? And he was like, do you have internet access? And they said yes, and he got all the stuff up. He got Hat News up. He said, I edit this, I contributed this, I've taken all those photos, I've done those films, I've done those interviews, I do this radio show. And they came back to him and said, your skills base is not necessarily what we were looking for, but you've proved yourself so proactive that we're going to give you the job. So, and eventually it's come round more to him doing a bit more of this kind of stuff again now. So that's my angle on things, you know, information provision, giving people chances to use kind of writing skills or developing writing skills.
Lovely, thank you very much.